What in the goddamn hell did you just do? That question, unspoken but screaming in the sudden, dead silence of the restaurant, hung in the air, colder and sharper than the ice water that was now soaking through a $5,000 Balenciaga gown and onto the perfect 7-month swell of a pregnant belly. If you want to see how this racist waitress's world completely falls apart when she discovers who she really messed with, you better hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And drop me a comment. Tell me, have you ever witnessed discrimination so ugly, so blatant, in your real life? The clock on the wall of Miami's most exclusive restaurant, the Gilded Spoon, read 9:13 p.m. It was a humid Thursday night, the kind where the air itself feels heavy with secrets. In a secluded corner booth, Dr. Alani Maxwell sat alone, a vision of elegance in a silk emerald dress that clung to the perfect curve of her 8-month pregnant belly, her fingers adorned with a diamond that seemed to steal the light from the entire room, nervously tapped against the screen of her phone. She'd been waiting for her husband for nearly half an hour, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by the other patrons. Their whispers were like the rustling of snakes in tall grass, their stares a mixture of envy and suspicion. She could feel their judgment, a cold weight in the opulent, air-conditioned room. One hand moved instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture, as her baby girl kicked, a tiny, insistent flutter against her palm, as if she could sense her mother's rising anxiety. That's when Crystal Vance, a waitress whose soul had been corroded by bitterness, decided to make her move. Crystal was 28, but the exhaustion etched onto her face made her look a decade older. She saw Alani's designer dress, her flawless makeup, her effortless grace, and it was like gasoline on the smoldering fire of her own failures. In her twisted mind, Alani represented everything she didn't have, everything she felt she'd been cheated out of. She wasn't just a customer, she was a symbol. With a predatory stillness, Crystal picked up a heavy glass pitcher of ice water from a nearby service station. The condensation dripped onto the polished floor, the only sound in the suddenly tense air. She walked toward Alani's table, her steps deliberate, her face a mask of false hospitality. And then, without a word, without a hint of warning, she upended the entire pitcher. An Arctic torrent of ice and water crashed down over Alani's head and shoulders, soaking her $5,000 dress in an instant. The shock of the cold was so intense it stole her breath. Ice cubes skittered across the table and clattered onto the floor. The entire restaurant fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Every conversation died. Every fork, every knife froze in mid-air. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. Alani sat there, gasping, water dripping from her hair, her ruined dress clinging to her skin, the cold seeping through to her very bones. For a terrifying second, her only thought was for her baby, a jolt of fear so powerful it eclipsed everything else. Crystal leaned in close, her breath hot and smelling of cheap coffee, her voice a low, venomous hiss meant only for Alani. "Oops," she sneered, the word dripping with malicious satisfaction. "Clumsy me. Maybe you should stick to the places where your kind actually belongs, instead of playing dress-up in a world you'll never be a part of." The humiliation was a physical blow, sharper and more painful than the freezing water. But as Crystal straightened up, expecting tears, expecting a scene, she saw something else entirely in Alani's eyes. Not fear, not weakness. It was a fire, a cold, controlled fury that was more terrifying than any scream. Alani rose to her feet, slow and deliberate, water cascading from her ruined dress to pool at her feet on the marble floor. She looked Crystal dead in the eye, her gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a coming storm, and every single person in that restaurant strained to hear it. "You have no idea," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the monumental effort it took to contain her rage. "What you have just done." Then, in a display of composure that stunned everyone, Alani reached into her handbag. Her hands shook, but she pulled out a crisp $100 bill, enough to cover the glass of sparkling water she hadn't even touched, and placed it on the soaked tablecloth. Beside it, she laid another 5 $100 bills. A $500 tip. A final silent statement. With her head held high, every inch the queen they had mistaken for a pauper, she walked toward the exit. Those closest to the door could see the sheen of tears she was desperately fighting back, could hear the tiny catch in her throat as she battled to maintain her dignity for herself and for her unborn child. Crystal stood frozen, a smirk still plastered on her face, trying to project victory to her gawking co-workers. "Guess I put her in her place," she muttered, but the tremor in her hands as she wiped down the table betrayed the gnawing unease that was beginning to curdle in her stomach. A small, terrified voice in the back of her mind whispered that she hadn't won anything. She had just started a war. She had no idea what was waiting just outside the restaurant's ornate doors. As Alani emerged into the warm Miami night, a custom, bulletproof Escalade pulled silently to the curb. A man stepped out from the driver's side, a man who moved with the lethal grace of a panther. This was Damian Maxwell. To the world, he was a legitimate, wildly successful real estate mogul and logistics expert. But in the shadows, to the people who truly ran the city, he was known by another name, the Ghost. He was a man whose influence was a hidden, sprawling web, a man who could make problems and people disappear with a single whispered phone call. When he saw his wife, her drenched hair, her ruined dress, the way she was shivering despite the heat, the unshed tears that made her eyes glitter with pain, his face, normally a calm, impenetrable mask, shifted into an expression of such cold, murderous rage that it would have stopped the heart of anyone who saw it. "Lonnie? Baby, what happened?" he asked, his voice a dangerously soft rumble. He wrapped a protective arm around her, his touch impossibly gentle despite the storm brewing inside him. As he helped her into the plush passenger seat, Alani looked back at the glowing facade of the Gilded Spoon, then into the dark, terrifying promise in her husband's eyes. Her voice broke as she uttered the 4 words that would seal Crystal Vance's fate. "Someone needs a lesson. If you want to witness the absolute obliteration of this waitress's world when she finds out she didn't just mess with a rich lady, but with the unofficial king of the city's underworld, you need to hit that subscribe button right now." I'm not exaggerating when I say what happens next will leave you speechless. Crystal Vance thought she had humiliated a powerless woman. She had just made the last and biggest mistake of her life. She had declared war on a man who never lost. Crystal Vance was drowning, and she had been for years. At 28, she was a single mother trapped in a life that felt like a cage. She worked grueling double shifts at the Gilded Spoon, a place where the cost of a single steak dinner could have paid her electric bill for 3 months. She lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of the city where the walls seemed to sweat in the relentless Florida heat, and the sirens were a nightly lullaby. Every night, she'd lie awake, staring at the water stains on her ceiling, consumed by a toxic cocktail of exhaustion and resentment. Why was her life so hard? Why did everyone else seem to glide through life while she was grinding her bones to dust just to keep her head above water? Just a month earlier, she'd been passed over for the head waitress position, a promotion that came with a raise that would have been life-altering. It would have meant she could finally afford the specialist for her 7-year-old son, Leo, whose persistent, wheezing cough the doctors couldn't seem to diagnose. It would have meant she could afford the better medication for her mother, whose arthritis was so bad some days she couldn't even get out of bed. But the job went to a younger, prettier girl who knew how to flirt with the manager. The rejection had festered inside Crystal, curdling into a deep-seated bitterness that poisoned everything she touched. This wasn't Crystal's first racist outburst. For months, she had been a quiet menace, targeting well-dressed black patrons with a particular brand of venom. A lost reservation here? A snide comment disguised as a joke there. She operated on the vile assumption that they were all imposters, fakes playing a part they hadn't earned. Each microaggression was a small, satisfying hit of power in her otherwise powerless life. It was a sick, twisted way of leveling the playing field in her own mind. If she couldn't rise up, she could at least drag someone else down to her level of misery. Management had always looked the other way. Crystal was a master of playing the victim. When the occasional complaint was filed, she could summon tears on command, sobbing about how she was a struggling single mother being unfairly targeted. What Crystal couldn't possibly know was that the woman she had just assaulted was Dr. Alani Maxwell, a 34-year-old double-board certified neonatal surgeon, a woman who had graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins and spent her days holding the fragile lives of premature babies in her hands. Despite a net worth of over $80 million, Alani had never forgotten the scholarship-funded, struggle-filled path she'd taken. She was humble, kind, and spent one weekend a month volunteering at a free clinic in the city's poorest neighborhood. Her husband, Damien the Ghost Maxwell, was another story entirely. On paper, he was a titan of industry. His portfolio of construction firms, import-export companies, and high-end real estate ventures was vast and impeccably legal. But the true source of his power lay in the shadows. It was in the hushed phone calls that ended the moment Alani walked into a room. It was in the late-night meetings with men whose tailored suits couldn't hide the hardness in their eyes, men who spoke in a coded language of favors and retribution. Damien had clawed his way up from nothing, building an empire not just of wealth, but of fear and loyalty, all to create a fortress around the one person he truly loved, his wife. The Gilded Spoon was his territory. It catered to the city's elite, politicians, celebrities, and the kind of dangerous men Damien did business with. The restaurant couldn't afford a scandal, but Crystal, consumed by her own petty hatred, didn't care. Her bitterness had become a blindfold, preventing her from seeing the catastrophic consequences of her actions. Within the hour, Crystal was in the restaurant's break room, celebrating her perceived victory. She bragged to the other servers about how she'd put that woman in her place, her eyes shining with a malicious glee that did little to hide the gaping emptiness in her soul. She even took to social media, posting a thinly veiled, triumphant message. Had to teach some fake rich trash a lesson tonight about knowing their place. Stay in your lane. Oi! The likes and supportive comments from her equally ignorant friends fueled her ego, a temporary balm on her wounded pride. But deep down, as she scrubbed the last of the water from the floor, a cold dread began to seep into her bones. The victory felt hollow, fragile, and terrifyingly incomplete. While Crystal preened in her bubble of hate, Damien Maxwell was making calls. His voice was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the inferno of rage that was threatening to consume him. His most trusted men, soldiers in his undeclared war, were ready to move on his command. They suggested immediate, brutal violence, a lesson that would be carved into Crystal's skin. But Damien held them back. "No," he said, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. "This won't be quick. This won't be messy. My wife handles her battles with grace. Disrespect to my family. That will be handled by me. I want her to understand. I want her to feel the walls closing in. I want her to know what it's like to have everything she loves squeezed until it breaks. He began his investigation. A cold, methodical dissection of Crystal Vance's life. His fury was a controlled burn, focused and all-consuming. He was preparing to deliver not just justice, but a masterclass in consequences. And Crystal had no idea that the monster she had provoked was now learning her name, her address, her son's name, and every single one of her weaknesses. The stress of the incident did exactly what Alani had feared. That same night, sharp, terrifying pains began to radiate through her abdomen. Early contractions. They rushed to the hospital, the sanctuary where Alani was a celebrated surgeon, and suddenly she was a patient, vulnerable and afraid. She sobbed in Damien's arms, not from the physical pain, but from the raw, emotional trauma of being so publicly degraded, of being made to feel like nothing. When the doctor, a close friend, warned Damien that the stress could seriously endanger both Alani and the baby, something inside him snapped. His controlled fury metastasized into something primordial and absolute. This was no longer about disrespect. Crystal Vance hadn't just insulted his wife, she had threatened the life of his unborn child, and for that, there was no forgiveness. There was only annihilation. Through his vast network, Damien quickly discovered a delicious irony. Through a series of shell corporations and holding companies, he indirectly owned the building that housed the Gilded Spoon. His construction company had built the entire luxury complex 5 years prior. His private security firm held the contracts for half the businesses on the block. Damien's web of influence was invisible, but omnipresent. And now every single thread of that web was going to be pulled, tightened, and used to systematically strangle Crystal Vance's life. Her vulnerability was a roadmap for his revenge. Her ex-husband, a degenerate gambler, owed a substantial amount of money to a loan shark who, conveniently, was on Damien's payroll. The threats against him, and by extension, Crystal and Leo, had been escalating. Her mother's life-sustaining medication came from a specialty pharmacy located in a medical building Damien owned. Her son, Leo, attended a public elementary school where, in another twist of fate, Dr. Alani Maxwell volunteered every month, providing free medical checkups to underprivileged children. While Crystal was spreading hate, Alani was healing children in the very community Crystal was a part of. Damien was assembling a complete, devastating picture of Crystal's life. And what he saw was a woman so precariously balanced on the edge of ruin that destroying her would be laughably easy. But Damien wasn't interested in an easy victory. He was interested in a lesson, a slow, agonizing, unforgettable lesson in power, respect, and consequences. 3 weeks after the incident at the Gilded Spoon, Crystal's world began to unravel. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, torturous crumbling that felt like a string of impossibly cruel coincidences. In reality, it was the perfectly executed first phase of Damien Maxwell's calculated takedown. It started at work. Her shifts were cut from 40 hours a week down to a meager 25. When she confronted her manager, her voice trembling with panic, he refused to meet her eyes. He mumbled something about budget cuts and a downturn in business, but Crystal saw the fear in his face. For the first time in months, the restaurant was bleeding money. The viral video of her racist attack, filmed by another diner and now spreading like wildfire across social media, was having a catastrophic effect. High-profile clients were canceling long-standing reservations, their assistants citing the unpleasant incident with disgust. The restaurant was becoming toxic, and Crystal was patient zero. Then came the letter from her apartment's management company. Her rent was being increased by $400 a month, effective immediately. When Crystal called, sobbing and pleading into the phone, a cold, indifferent voice cited market adjustments and new building policies. What Crystal didn't know was that one of Damien's real estate firms had quietly acquired her apartment building 2 weeks earlier. The policy changes were perfectly legal, meticulously documented by Damien's army of lawyers. Next, her car insurance. She received a notification that her premium was spiking by 60%. A routine review, they claimed, had reclassified her as a high-risk driver. When she screamed at the customer service representative, her voice cracking with helpless rage, they vaguely mentioned previously undiscovered incidents in her file. Incidents that existed only in the expertly forged paperwork Damien's people had created and planted. Within a month, Crystal was drowning. She couldn't understand it. It felt like the universe itself had turned against her. She picked up extra work wherever she could find it, serving at catered events, cleaning offices late at night. But it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. No matter how many hours she worked, the financial pressure only intensified. Her mother's medication costs inexplicably rose due to supply chain issues. Leo's medical bills for his worsening cough were piling up, and her ex-husband's debt collectors, the men who worked for Damien's loan shark, had stopped calling. They started showing up. One evening, 2 large, silent men were waiting for her in the dimly lit hallway outside her apartment. They didn't threaten her directly. They just looked at her, then looked at the door to her apartment where her son was sleeping, and one of them said, "Payments due. It would be a shame if something happened to this nice, quiet little family." Crystal started lashing out, blaming everyone. Her manager was a coward. Her landlord was a greedy pig. The insurance company was a corrupt scam. She raged against a world she saw as fundamentally unfair, never once considering that this storm of misfortune wasn't random chance, but the targeted, deliberate wrath of the man whose family she had tried to hurt. Meanwhile, Damien orchestrated every move with the precision of a surgeon. His heart was a cold, hard stone of calculated revenge, fueled by a ferocious, protective love for his wife and child. He didn't need overt violence. He wielded something far more terrifying. The invisible levers of power, the legitimate channels of business, to slowly and completely suffocate her. But then, Alani found out what he was doing. She discovered the detailed file on his desk, the complete blueprint of Crystal's destruction. And instead of the horror Damien expected, he saw a flicker of dark satisfaction in her eyes that chilled him. "I want to be there when she finally understands," Alani said, her voice quiet but laced with steel. "I want her to know exactly who did this to her. I want her to know what happens when you disrespect our family." Damien looked up from his papers, startled by the ice in his wife's tone. He could see that something in her had fundamentally shifted. The gentle, compassionate doctor was still there, but underneath, Crystal's racist attack had forged something new, a core of hardened resolve. "I thought you'd want me to stop," he said, genuinely surprised. "I thought this would be too much for you." Alani was a tempest of warring emotions. The healer in her recoiled from the cruelty, but the wounded woman, the protective mother, was winning. The memory of the humiliation still burned like a fresh wound. The shock of the cold, the venom in Crystal's words, the silent judgment of the other diners, the terrifying contractions that had put her in the hospital. It was all still there, a constant, throbbing pain. "She's a single mother, Damien, with a sick child," Alani said, but her voice was devoid of the compassion that usually defined her. "Good. Maybe now she'll understand what it feels like to be powerless, to watch someone you love suffer while strangers decide their fate." "Lonnie," Damien's voice was laced with concern. He had wanted justice for his wife, but this cold fury in her eyes, so much like his own, was unsettling. "Are you sure about this? Once we go down this path, there's no coming back." Alani's voice cracked with a bitter, tearful rage. She poured a pitcher of ice water on me while I was 8 months pregnant with our daughter. She tried to strip me of my dignity, my humanity, simply because of the color of my skin. She made me feel worthless, Damien. Like I didn't deserve to exist in the same room as her. There is no such thing as too far when someone does that. Damien watched his wife, a sense of profound unease settling over him. The woman he loved, the woman dedicated to healing and compassion, was now talking about retribution with a coldness that mirrored his own. He realized that Crystal Vance's casual act of racism had done more than just humiliate Alani. It had fundamentally altered her. It had awakened a dormant, dangerous part of her soul. "What do you want me to do?" Damien asked quietly. Alani's smile was as sharp and beautiful as a shard of broken glass. "I want her to lose everything. Everything she used as an excuse to hate me. I want her to hit rock bottom so hard she shatters. And then, Damien," she looked at him, her eyes holding no trace of mercy. "I want her to know that the woman she thought was beneath her was the one who orchestrated her downfall. I want her to beg me for help." For the first time since this all began, Damien felt a genuine chill run down his spine. He had unleashed something in his wife that he might not be able to control. And he wondered if Crystal Vance had any idea that the gentle doctor she had attacked had just become her most formidable and merciless enemy. The immense stress was taking a devastating toll on Alani's pregnancy. The complications returned with a terrifying vengeance. More premature contractions, more late-night rushes to the hospital that filled Damien with a primal fear he had never known. Her doctor's warnings became more dire, the words premature labor and high risk hanging in the air like a death sentence. And every single pang of pain, every moment of fear, could be traced back to the humiliation and stress inflicted by Crystal. One night, Damien got another emergency call from the hospital. As he raced through the city streets, the world blurring into a meaningless smear of lights, something inside him fundamentally shifted. His protective instincts went into hyperdrive, overriding all rational thought. This was no longer about a lesson or calculated revenge. Crystal Vance's actions were now a direct, active threat to his unborn daughter's life. With chilling clarity, Damien realized that Crystal's racism had created a lethal chain reaction. Every contraction Alani suffered, every tear she shed, every sleepless night they endured was a direct result of that one hateful moment. The revenge that followed would shock you to your core. But first I have to ask you, was Damien's systematic destruction of Crystal's life justified, or did he cross a line? Tell me your honest opinion in the comments. And if your heart is pounding right now, smash that like button, because the final confrontation is about to happen, and it will absolutely blow your mind. 3 weeks after that fateful night, Crystal's life was no longer crumbling. It was a smoldering ruin. The final blows came in a rapid, merciless succession that shattered her world completely and irrevocably. It started with the phone call that every parent dreads. Her son, Leo, had collapsed on the playground during recess, his small body convulsing, his lips turning blue as he gasped for air that wouldn't come. The sheer panic in the school nurse's voice sent a spear of ice through Crystal's heart. She raced to the hospital, her mind a screaming vortex of terror. The emergency room doctors delivered the news with grim finality. Leo had a rare, undiagnosed congenital heart defect. It had suddenly become critical. He needed immediate, complex, open-heart surgery. Without it, the doctor said, looking her directly in the eyes, he likely wouldn't survive more than 48 hours. The words hit Crystal with the force of a physical blow, and the world tilted, threatening to plunge her into darkness. Then came the second hammer blow. The surgery would cost $68,000. Her pitiful insurance plan, the best she could afford, would cover less than half. She needed to come up with $34,000, a sum so astronomical it might as well have been $1 billion. The hospital's financial administrator made it brutally clear: no payment guarantee, no surgery. As Crystal sat numbly in the hallway, trying to process this impossible nightmare, her phone rang again. It was her manager from the Gilded Spoon. "Crystal, you're fired," he said, his voice cold and distant. "Effective immediately. Your final check will be mailed." The viral video had become a PR catastrophe, costing the restaurant hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue. Her desperate, sobbing pleas about her dying son were met with a dial tone. She was still reeling from that when a call came from her mother's nursing home. Her mother's insurance had abruptly discontinued coverage for her essential arthritis medication due to policy changes. The out-of-pocket cost was now $4,000 a month. Crystal hung up the phone and let out a dry, broken sob. There were no tears left. She felt nothing but a vast, empty abyss of despair. The final insult came that evening, in the form of an eviction notice taped to her door, the stark, official letters seeming to mock her. She had 7 days to pay the back rent and all the new late fees, or she and her dying son would be on the streets. She found herself back in the sterile, fluorescent-lit pediatric ICU of Mercy General Hospital. She sat beside Leo's bed, holding his small, cold hand. He was so pale, so still, surrounded by a spiderweb of tubes and wires, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor the only sound in the room. Each beep was a countdown to the end of her world. Her heart didn't just ache. It felt like it had been physically ripped from her chest. A distinguished surgeon, Dr. Matthews, entered the room, his face etched with grave concern as he reviewed Leo's chart. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice heavy with compassion. "Your son is in critical condition. We need to operate within the next 24 hours. The cost is the only obstacle." "I don't have it," Crystal whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "My insurance, please, isn't there anything you can do?" Dr. Matthews looked at her with genuine sympathy. "There might be one last option. There's a philanthropist in the city, a very powerful businessman who sometimes helps with extreme medical cases like this. Damian Maxwell. His foundation has been known to work miracles. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot you have." Crystal clung to the name like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. She didn't recognize it, but it didn't matter. If this man, this stranger, was her son's only hope, she would get on her hands and knees and beg. "How do I find him?" she asked, a flicker of desperate hope in her dead eyes. "His office is downtown. Maxwell Holdings," Dr. Matthews said gently. "But Mrs. Vance, these are not decisions made lightly. You will have to plead your case to him directly." 2 hours later, Crystal stood in the impossibly luxurious lobby of Maxwell Holdings. The air was cool and smelled of money and power. Her hands, clutching Leo's medical files, trembled uncontrollably. To her astonishment, when she explained the life-or-death urgency to the receptionist, she was told Mr. Maxwell would see her immediately. She was escorted into a vast corner office that overlooked the entire city. A man stood with his back to her, a silhouette of immense power against the glittering skyline. When he turned around, Crystal's blood turned to ice in her veins. Her world didn't just collapse, it was utterly annihilated. It was him, the man from the Escalade outside the restaurant, the husband. "So," Damian Maxwell said, his voice a silken, deadly calm as he gestured to the chair in front of his massive mahogany desk. "You're Crystal Vance, the woman who threw ice water on my pregnant wife and told her she didn't belong." The truth crashed down on Crystal with the force of a tsunami, stealing the air from her lungs. She's your wife?" she stammered, her mind refusing to comprehend the scale of her mistake. "So, all of this, my job, my apartment, it was you." Yes, Damien said, settling into his chair like a king ascending his throne. I have been systematically dismantling your life, piece by painful piece, since the moment you decided to lay your hands on my wife because you didn't like the color of her skin. That would be me. Crystal broke. A guttural, animalistic sob tore from her throat, and she collapsed in the chair, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable spasms of grief. My son, she wailed, the words barely intelligible. He's dying. He needs the surgery. I know what I did. It was monstrous, unforgivable. But please, please, I'm begging you, don't let my little boy die because of my hate. Damien studied her, his face an unreadable mask. He watched her complete and utter disintegration, her abject desperation, her dawning, horrified understanding of true powerlessness. Your son needs $68,000 to live, he said, his voice soft but sharp as a razor's edge, and you came to me. To the man whose unborn child you put at risk. Do you see the beautiful, tragic irony in that, Mrs. Vance? Please, Crystal whispered through her tears, her voice gone. I'll do anything. I'll make a public apology. I'll work for you for the rest of my life, for free. I'll do anything, just please, save my son. Damien leaned back, steepling his fingers. You assumed my wife, a brilliant surgeon who saves babies for a living, didn't belong. You tried to humiliate a pregnant woman in a room full of strangers, and now you sit in my office, begging the husband of the woman you assaulted to save your child's life. I know, she sobbed, her devastation absolute. I know I don't deserve it, but Leo, he's just a little boy. He's innocent. Please. Just then, the office door opened and Alani walked in. She looked at the sobbing, broken woman in the chair, and then at her husband. Crystal's head snapped up, and when she saw Alani, she let out a cry of such profound despair it seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. She stumbled out of the chair and fell to her knees before Alani. I'm so sorry, she choked out, her words a torrent of broken, soul-crushing guilt. I was miserable. I was drowning in my own life, and I hated you because you weren't. I thought you were just pretending, that you didn't deserve to be there. Oh God, I was so wrong. I was a monster. Alani's voice was steady, but Crystal could hear the deep, lingering hurt beneath the surface. So you decided racism was the solution to your problems? You chose to humiliate a pregnant woman because you were having a bad day? Crystal's face was a mess of tears and shame. Please, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. Please don't punish my son for my sins. He's innocent. Alani looked at this shattered woman, this husk of a human being, and felt the ice around her own heart begin to crack. She saw not a monster, but a person so consumed by her own pain that she had become a vessel for it. She looked at Damien, and in that silent glance, a decision was made. Damien's voice cut through the air, carrying the weight of absolute power over life and death. I'm going to pay for your son's surgery. Crystal looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Every single cent. Dr. Matthews will perform the operation tonight. But after he is safe, he continued, his voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about the price of redemption. Leo's surgery took 8 grueling hours. Crystal spent every second in the hospital chapel, on her knees, praying not to a God she felt had abandoned her, but to the very people she had tried to destroy. When Dr. Matthews finally appeared, his face tired but smiling, and told her the surgery was a success, that Leo was stable and in recovery, the reality of what had happened finally shattered her. The people she had dehumanized, the people whose humanity she had tried to strip away, had just saved her son's life. She collapsed in the hospital hallway, her cries echoing off the sterile walls. cries not just of relief, but of a profound, soul-altering shame. 3 days later, Alani walked into Leo's recovery room. Crystal hadn't left his side. She was a ghost, gaunt and hollow-eyed, consumed by a guilt so profound it was a physical illness. "Mrs. Vance," Alani said gently, her voice devoid of anger. "We need to talk about what happens next." Crystal couldn't meet her eyes. "I keep thinking about your baby," she whispered, her voice raw. "When I poured that water on you, I could have hurt your child. I could have made you lose your baby, all because I was bitter and couldn't stand to see a black woman have more than me. What kind of monster does that?" Alani's own eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for the utterly broken woman before her. "Crystal, look at me." When Crystal finally raised her head, Alani saw that the hatred had been burned away, replaced by a raw, transformative remorse. "You have a choice to make," Alani said. "My husband can complete what he started. He can take your apartment, your mother's care, everything. He can ensure you spend the rest of your life struggling for every scrap." Crystal flinched, but then nodded, a tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "I deserve it. I deserve all of it." "Or," Alani continued, her voice heavy with the weight of the grace she was about to offer, "you can choose redemption. But this won't be easy. This is about fundamentally rewiring your soul. It's about facing the ugliness inside of you and dedicating your life to becoming someone worthy of your son's love." Crystal's public apology was not a carefully worded PR statement. It was a raw, brutal confession that went viral, sparking a national conversation. Standing on the steps of the Gilded Spoon, she spoke from a heart that had been broken open and cauterized by consequence. 3 weeks ago, in this restaurant, I committed an act of racist violence against a pregnant black woman," she began, her voice shaking as tears streamed down her face. "But the truth is worse. I wanted to hurt her. I wanted to make her feel as small and worthless as I felt inside. Dr. Alani Maxwell is a neonatal surgeon who saves babies. She is everything I pretended she wasn't. But even if she had been none of those things, what I did would still be unforgivable." She looked directly at the cameras, her eyes blazing with a desperate sincerity. "The woman I tried to destroy with my racism saved my son's life. I almost poisoned my own child with my hate. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, because I haven't earned it. I am asking for the chance to spend the rest of my life proving that a person can change, that the worst parts of us don't have to be the end of the story." Crystal didn't just attend diversity training, she immersed herself in it. She worked at a community center for single mothers in a predominantly black neighborhood. The first time she tried to help a young, pregnant mother, the woman flinched away from her, her eyes filled with a weary distrust that broke Crystal's heart all over again. She recognized that look. It was the armor people are forced to wear after a lifetime of being hurt by people who looked just like Crystal. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Crystal told her, her voice thick with humility. "But I need to learn how to heal instead of hurt. Please, let me help." 6 months later, Alani and Damien walked into Bella Vista, an elegant new restaurant downtown. In a baby carrier, their daughter, Isabella, slept peacefully. Their server approached the table, her movements confident and her smile genuine. It was Crystal. Her heart pounded, but she met their gaze, her eyes bright with unshed tears of overwhelming gratitude. "Dr. and Mr. Maxwell," she said, her voice steady. "Welcome. It is an honor to serve you." Alani looked at her, truly looked, and saw a woman reborn from the ashes of her own hatred. The bitterness was gone, replaced by a hard-won wisdom. "Crystal," Alani said softly, "how are you?" "I'm becoming someone my son can be proud of," Crystal replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Every day I work to become someone who deserves the grace you showed me when I deserved nothing but destruction." Later that week, Crystal was training a new group of servers. "Every person who walks through that door," she told them, her voice carrying the weight of her journey, "is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's everything. When you are drowning in your own pain, it is tempting to try and drag someone else down with you. I almost destroyed an innocent family because I couldn't handle my own failures." A young waitress asked hesitantly, "But what if you really don't think someone belongs?" Crystal's response came from the deepest part of her transformed soul, her voice breaking with the raw power of her learned truth. "Then you remember that love is always the answer. The moment you decide someone doesn't belong because of what they look like, you have lost your own humanity. Damien and Alani Maxwell could have destroyed me, and the world would have said they were justified. Instead, they taught me that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the painful work of becoming worthy of it. The woman I was died in that hospital, realizing what my hatred had almost cost my son. The woman I am today was born from their mercy, and I will spend every day of my life honoring that gift by making sure no one else has to learn that lesson the way I did. The cycle of prejudice wasn't just broken. It was transformed into a cycle of love, understanding, and radical grace that rippled outward, touching everyone in its path. Crystal Vance learned that the most powerful force in the universe isn't hate or revenge. It's the breathtaking courage to choose love when you've been given every reason to choose hate, and the strength to keep choosing it every single day for the rest of your life. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.